Hey guys, tonight we're going to embark on a strange and fascinating journey through the bizarre world of medieval fashion. Picture this. You're walking through a misty forest. The air smells of wet earth and damp wool, and suddenly you're face to face with a group of knights, their armour shining in the twilight like an odd mixture of brute strength and glitter. But wait, what about the people around them? No, not the armoured warriors, but the peasants, the traders, the merchants. What are they wearing? Can you guess? If your mind is swirling with images of extravagant robes, brightly coloured fabrics, and fantastical accessories, I hate to break it to you, but the truth is a lot less glamorous and a whole lot more practical. Medieval fashion didn't always have the glitz and glamour you might expect. In fact, it's a journey through time that will make you question how we went from practical tunics to, well, whatever you've seen in those medieval movies with way too many layers and weird hats. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, let me know where you're watching from. What time is it in your corner of the world? And if you're cozying up in your bed right now, let's get the lights dimmed, turn on a fan for that soothing hum, and ease into tonight's journey together. Alright, let's start where it all began, the medieval beginnings of fashion. The Middle Ages were a time that spanned 1,000 years, from 500 AD to about 1500 AD, and for most of that time, the average person wasn't thinking about high fashion. They were more concerned about staying warm, getting through a harsh winter, or simply staying alive. So when you imagine medieval fashion before the year 1000, what do you picture? Maybe a cloak thrown over your shoulders, a tunic that doesn't reach the floor but feels just fine, or a woolen hat that doesn't really look like a hat, but more like a very awkward piece of cloth wrapped around your head. Well, that's about the gist of it. Life before 1000 AD was centred around survival, and fashion, as we know it today, didn't play a major role in everyday life. For most of the early medieval period, people wore simple, functional garments, tunics and cloaks made from wool or linen. These garments were practical and, dare I say, not much to write home about. They were loose-fitting, providing comfort and warmth rather than style. That meant no tight pants, no luxurious velvet, and definitely no high heels, thankfully. They were designed to protect from the elements, plain and simple. Wool was the go-to material for most people because it was durable, kept you warm, and, well, you could find it just about anywhere in Europe. Linen, which came from flax, was another popular option, especially during the warmer months. It was a bit more breathable than wool, but just as functional. You might be surprised to hear that even the most basic medieval attire could give us clues about the social class of the wearer. Common folk would wear rougher fabrics, usually undyed, whereas wealthier individuals would enjoy a finer quality of wool, possibly dyed with brighter colours, though even then their wardrobe was fairly simple. The aristocracy, on the other hand, would have more intricate tunics, perhaps with some embroidery, and if they were particularly wealthy, a finer fabric like silk might have made an appearance, though this was extremely rare before 1000 AD. But that doesn't mean fashion wasn't important. Oh no, it just wasn't the elaborate affair we tend to think about. People still had to make sure their clothes fit the status quo. There were already subtle ways to communicate your wealth or social standing through clothing, like the length of your tunic or the type of material you wore. The rich could afford longer tunics, and perhaps even a few embellishments, while the poor were stuck with shorter, simpler garments. This practical fashion wasn't about trend-setting. It was about survival and social identity. It wasn't until later in the Middle Ages, around the 12th century, that things really began to get interesting. Suddenly, wealthier people started becoming more daring with their clothing. More expensive dyes became available, and fabrics like silk were now being imported from the East. Thanks to new technologies in dyeing and the increasing availability of luxuries from the East through trade routes, clothes began to have more vibrant colours, though they still weren't as extravagant as what we'd later see in the Renaissance. What's most interesting about the early Middle Ages is that fashion wasn't just about looking good. It had a functional purpose. Clothing was about protecting your body and showing your status, with a side of practicality. If you've ever felt the itch to complain about your work uniform or the temperature of your office, imagine being stuck in a wool tunic for 100 years. Fashion, for most of the Middle Ages, was really all about survival and social identity rather than style or extravagance. And yet, history has a way of being, well, unpredictable. While the common folk were trudging along in their basic garb, the ruling classes were starting to dip their toes into something far more fashionable. So while most people were stuck in practical tunics that wouldn't win any fashion awards, their wealthier counterparts were beginning to experiment with more luxurious textiles and ornate details. This shift wouldn't become fully apparent until the second half of the medieval period. But for now, we're just getting started. Keep in mind, though, the weirdness we're about to witness with fashion in the Middle Ages doesn't come out of nowhere. It's a result of evolving circumstances, social change, political power, and even religious influence. So let's keep moving forward, because medieval fashion is about to get a lot more unusual. As we move forward in our exploration of medieval fashion, we find ourselves at a crossroads, a moment where practicality began to collide with a rising sense of individualism and luxury. But before we dive into the extravagant world of medieval trends, let's pause for a second and understand the driving force behind this shift. The Church. Yes, the Church. That holy institution which held such sway over the lives of medieval men and women. You might be wondering, how does the Church fit into this discussion of medieval fashion? Well, the answer is both complex and paradoxical. The influence of the Church during the Middle Ages was far-reaching, and that influence extended to fashion too. In fact, the Church had a very peculiar relationship with clothing. On the one hand, the Church advocated for modesty, calling for people to dress in a way that reflected their humble status before God. The idea of modesty in fashion wasn't just about covering up. It was about signalling that your worth wasn't tied to your appearance. You were meant to dress in a way that focused on your inner piety, not your outward show. Monks and nuns, for instance, wore simple robes that reflected their devotion to a life of prayer, austerity, and service. But on the other hand, the Church's own clergy was not exactly living by these modest guidelines when it came to their own attire. In fact, the Church itself was quite the paradox when it came to fashion. While it was advocating for modesty and humility, many of its leaders wore some of the most extravagant garments in all of medieval Europe. The robes of bishops and cardinals were made from the finest fabrics, embroidered with gold thread and accessorized with elaborate hats and crowns. These garments were not just fashion statements, they were political tools. By wearing such elaborate clothing, the clergy was able to signal their wealth and power, establishing a clear distinction between them and the common folk. In a sense, the Church's fashion choices were about maintaining control, about reminding the peasants and townsfolk that the clergy was at the top of the social hierarchy. Historians still argue whether the Church's influence on fashion was truly contradictory, or if it was a form of political strategy. Some believe that the clergy's expensive attire was meant to solidify their authority in a society that was still very much entrenched in medieval feudalism. Others argue that the Church's relationship with fashion was more about displaying divine favour, with the wealthier clergy using their opulent garments to reflect the idea that they were chosen by God to serve in a special way. Either way, the Church's contradictory relationship with clothing had a profound impact on the fashion choices of the common people, who, by the way, were still expected to adhere to more modest standards. For the common folk, however, life wasn't about flaunting wealth in the way that the clergy or nobility did. Instead, medieval peasants had a very different approach to fashion, one that was focused on necessity rather than show. But that didn't mean fashion wasn't important to them. In fact, clothing was an essential part of medieval life, even for the poor. While the rich were adorned in luxurious fabrics and intricate designs, the poor were still concerned with how they dressed. They just had to get a little more creative with their limited resources. If you were a commoner, your wardrobe would likely consist of simple woolen tunics, linen undergarments, and maybe a cloak or a simple headdress to protect you from the elements. But even within these humble garments, people found ways to communicate their social standing. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval fashion for the lower classes was the role of colour. While rich dyes were often reserved for the nobility, peasants still found ways to add colour to their clothes. These colours were not as vibrant as the ones you'd find in the wardrobes of royalty, but they were still a statement. For instance, peasants might use plant-based dyes like indigo or woad to create blue and purple tones, or they might use madder to create reds. These were the colours of the earth, natural hues that didn't require expensive imports, but still allowed individuals to differentiate themselves from others. While medieval commoners didn't have the luxury of silk or fine velvet, they could still express some individuality through the colours and patterns of their clothing. Now back to the rising nobility. As Europe's wealth and power began to shift, so too did its fashion. Enter the 12th century, a time of growing wealth, emerging trade routes, and the expansion of the Romanesque style. The aristocracy was starting to embrace a new level of opulence that would continue to influence fashion for centuries. So, what did they wear during this period? Let's take a look at the trendiest looks of the time. In the 12th century, the nobility began wearing garments that were much more elaborate than those of their peasant counterparts. Silks and velvets became more common, and embroidered patterns started to emerge, often depicting religious or mythological scenes. The silhouette of the time was long, flowing, and elegant. A typical nobleman or woman might wear a tunic with long sleeves, often adorned with rich details like gold thread or intricate beadwork. These garments weren't just about appearance, they were meant to convey power and status. To the people around them, it was clear who had money and who didn't. One of the most notable fashion statements of the 12th century was the wide use of fur. Fur was a luxury material, and the nobility was quick to adopt it as a sign of their high status. Fur-lined cloaks, fur collars, and fur-trimmed garments became standard features in aristocratic wardrobes. In fact, fur became so associated with the nobility that it was often used to distinguish between the classes. Imagine walking through a medieval marketplace, where you could spot a noble from a mile away, simply by the luxurious furs draped over their shoulders. For the peasants, fur was a rare commodity, something reserved for the wealthy and powerful. It wasn't just practical, it was a symbol of wealth and privilege. Of course, as is often the case with fashion, what goes up must come down. The increasing complexity of clothing in the 12th century led to the rise of skilled craftsmen who specialised in tailoring and embroidery. These artisans were highly sought after, and their work was prized by the rich. But as clothing became more elaborate, it also became more expensive. The cost of acquiring such garments was out of reach for most peasants, creating a stark division between the classes. And yet, despite the growing wealth and fashion trends of the nobility, medieval fashion still had an odd, sometimes uncomfortable practicality to it. People still had to wear clothing that could withstand the harsh realities of medieval life. That's why we see the emergence of strange and unexpected items in the medieval wardrobe. Things like pointed shoes, padded tunics, and bizarre headgear. Fashion, after all, was not just about looking good. It was about surviving and thriving in a world that was still very much shaped by war, plague, and political instability. So, as the Middle Ages wore on, the line between practicality and extravagance continued to blur. Nobles began to indulge in luxury garments, using expensive fabrics, fur, and jewellery, while the lower classes made do with what they had, though still finding ways to express their individuality through colour and pattern. As we continue our journey through medieval fashion, we'll see just how this tension between necessity and indulgence plays out in the most bizarre ways possible. From bizarre shoes to armour that doubled as a fashion statement, the Middle Ages were anything but dull when it came to clothing. Historians still argue whether this fashion evolution was driven by necessity, social change, or pure vanity. Was the rise in elaborate clothing merely a reflection of the increased wealth of the time, or was it a way for the elite to distinguish themselves from the lower classes? One thing is certain. The Middle Ages were a time of fascinating contradictions, and fashion was no exception. As we continue our journey through the bizarre and fascinating world of medieval fashion, we now find ourselves facing a peculiar and sometimes surprising trend: tapestries. When you think of fashion, your mind might not immediately jump to walls decorated with woven art, but in medieval Europe, tapestries were a significant part of both art and fashion. These beautiful, intricate textile pieces were not only a symbol of wealth, but they also had a unique role in shaping the way people viewed themselves and their social standing. Let's dive into the world of medieval tapestries and how they influenced fashion, not just as decoration, but as a method of showcasing one's status, power, and taste. Now picture yourself in the grand hall of a noble family's estate. You walk through the entrance, and immediately your gaze is drawn upward to the rich, vibrant tapestries that hang on the walls. These weren't just decorative pieces, they were a reflection of the wealth and refinement of the family that owned them. The designs were often based on religious themes, mythological stories, or historical events, and they depicted scenes so intricate that you could lose yourself in the details. As you walk through the hall, you're enveloped by the elaborate fabrics that were not only visually stunning, but also extremely expensive. Tapestries became a key status symbol for the wealthy in the Middle Ages. Unlike paintings or sculptures, tapestries were made from wool, silk, and gold thread, which meant that they were incredibly costly to produce. The production of these tapestries was a lengthy and labour-intensive process, requiring skilled artisans who would spend months, sometimes even years, working on a single piece. The cost of these tapestries often rivaled that of a fine house or a valuable piece of land, making them a true symbol of wealth and power. And while the elite used tapestries to decorate their homes, the noble class was also keenly aware of the social and political power they held through these creations. Historians still debate whether the rise in tapestry production was due to a desire for beauty, a desire for status, or a combination of both. Was the creation of these tapestries merely a way to demonstrate power and wealth, or was it also a genuine desire to create something beautiful and meaningful? Some argue that the wealthy class used tapestries to reflect their refinement and taste. After all, if you could afford a tapestry woven with intricate designs and precious materials, you were not just displaying your wealth, you were also demonstrating your cultural sophistication. Tapestries were often used to tell stories, and in doing so they became a powerful tool for communication. Interestingly, the influence of tapestries extended beyond just the walls of a noble family's hall. The motifs and patterns found in these tapestries began to appear in clothing too. It wasn't uncommon to see nobles and royalty donning garments adorned with patterns that echoed the images and designs found in the tapestries hanging in their homes. Think of it as a way of bringing the wealth and grandeur of their homes with them wherever they went. Nobles were known to commission clothes made of fine fabrics that mimicked the intricate patterns and designs of the tapestries they so proudly displayed. The role of tapestries in fashion wasn't just limited to elite circles. Even in the early medieval period, tapestries were a way of conveying social status and power. While the wealthy had the luxury of using elaborate designs and rich materials, the lower classes often had to make do with simpler versions. They too would use tapestries to adorn their homes, though these tapestries would be less elaborate and more functional. For example, some tapestries were used as blankets or curtains, providing both warmth and decoration. While their designs may have been less intricate, these pieces still carried social meaning. Tapestries in peasant homes could reflect regional styles with simple patterns that indicated local traditions or cultural identity. But it wasn't just the aristocracy who enjoyed the luxury of tapestries. The production and trade of tapestries became an important economic activity, and some towns in Europe became known for their tapestry production. In cities like Bruges, France, and Flanders, weaving communities developed around the craft, producing tapestries not just for local elites, but for export as well. This rise in tapestry production and trade was another way in which fashion and textile production became interconnected. As tapestries grew in popularity, so did the demand for more luxurious fabrics, intricate patterns, and skilled artisans. In turn, the fashion industry in medieval Europe became more specialized, with certain cities or regions known for producing high-quality garments or textiles. The influence of tapestries on fashion wasn't confined to just clothing either. As textiles began to play a larger role in the economy, the concept of fashion, something we think of as purely visual, began to shift. In the Middle Ages, fashion became inextricably linked to wealth, trade, and craftsmanship. While the nobles and royals were enjoying their sumptuous tapestries, the common folk were still dealing with more practical concerns. The gap between the classes was becoming more apparent as the rich displayed their wealth not only through tapestries and textiles, but through their clothing as well. In the middle of all this opulence, it's important to remember that medieval fashion wasn't just about looking good. It was about survival, about making a statement, and about understanding the delicate balance between practicality and luxury. The rich used tapestries as a way to display their power, while the common folk saw them as a symbol of aspiration, an ideal of wealth that was just out of reach. Yet, even in their simplicity, the tapestries of the lower classes were a way for people to communicate their status and cultural identity. As the Middle Ages wore on and wealth continued to grow, it's no surprise that clothing would evolve in tandem with the tapestry trend. The 12th and 13th centuries saw the rise of more intricate patterns in clothing, from the use of bright dyes to the incorporation of symbolic motifs. By the time the 14th century rolled around, the fashion world had transformed from simple tunics and cloaks to ornate garments fit for royalty. Nobles would wear garments decorated with elaborate patterns, gold thread, and precious gems, and in a way these clothing items became living versions of the tapestries they had on their walls. What we can take away from this is that fashion in the medieval period was never just about the clothes people wore. It was about how they fit into the larger social, cultural and political fabric of society. Whether you were a peasant or a noble, your clothing, or the tapestries in your home, spoke volumes about who you were and where you stood in the social hierarchy. Tapestries and textiles became a way of communicating wealth, power, and status, and their influence on fashion was profound. Historians are still debating how much of medieval fashion was genuinely a reflection of individual taste, and how much was dictated by the prevailing societal structures. Was fashion in the medieval period truly a way to express individuality, or was it merely a tool for reinforcing social order? As we continue our journey through the Middle Ages, we'll see how these questions played out in some of the most outlandish and quirky fashion trends of the time. The influence of tapestries is just the beginning. As we continue our dive into the intricate and sometimes bizarre world of medieval fashion, we're about to explore something a bit more colourful. Now, before you imagine the vibrant neon colours we see in modern fashion, think again. The colours of medieval Europe were intense, but they were also incredibly costly, and signified far more than just a desire to stand out. In fact, medieval fashion wasn't just about looking flashy, it was about making bold social statements. The colours people wore were often determined by class, wealth, and even the region they lived in. And when it comes to medieval fashion, colour wasn't just something to admire, it was something to envy, something to aspire to, and sometimes something to fear. So, what was the deal with colour in medieval fashion? Well, the first thing to understand is that colour in the Middle Ages wasn't like the rainbow palette we have today. Sure, the rich wore bright, bold colours, but getting those hues wasn't easy. Let's start with the basics. Dyes. Medieval dyes were made from plants, minerals, and even insects. For instance, a common dye for vibrant red was made from the crushed bodies of a type of insect known as the cochineal. Blue dyes were derived from woad or indigo, while purple hues were often made from the shells of sea snails, a process that was extremely labour-intensive and costly. The result? Colours like purple, red and blue were expensive, and as such, they became associated with wealth and power. Royalty, the aristocracy and the clergy wore these colours to distinguish themselves from the common folk, and in doing so they created a colour hierarchy that mirrored the social structure. In essence, the rich wore the bright colours, and the poor wore more subdued natural tones. These colours were symbolic, not just of wealth, but of authority, dominance and sometimes divine favour. Purple, in particular, was reserved almost exclusively for royalty, and if a commoner dared to wear it, it could result in severe consequences. Purple was the colour of kings, and wearing it was a way of signalling that you were above your station, an offence that could lead to punishment or even death in some cases. Historians still argue whether the association of certain colours with specific social classes was simply a practical matter. After all, the dyes used for brighter colours were far more expensive to produce, or whether it was a deliberate way of reinforcing social hierarchies. Some historians contend that the choice of colour was more than just a matter of wealth. It was an outward expression of divine right and earthly power. When kings and queens donned purple garments, they were not just asserting their wealth, they were also affirming their status as divinely chosen rulers. The symbolism of colour in medieval fashion ran deep, and it wasn't just about personal preference, it was about authority, lineage and control. But it wasn't just royalty who had access to bright, expensive colours. As trade routes expanded during the medieval period, fabrics and dyes from the East became more readily available. The influence of the Islamic world in particular had a profound effect on European fashion. The Moorish empires of Spain and North Africa were known for their exquisite silk textiles and rich dyes, and through trade and cultural exchange, many of these materials and techniques made their way to Europe. The result was a fusion of styles and colours, as European nobility embraced the bright, intricate patterns and luxurious fabrics that had been used by the Moors for centuries. Still, while the aristocracy revelled in rich colours, the common folk were stuck with more basic, muted tones. The average peasant didn't have the resources to buy expensive dyes, and thus their clothing remained in shades of brown, grey and beige. Wool was the fabric of choice, and while it could be dyed, it wasn't the vibrant, luxurious wool used by the upper classes. Instead, it was often dyed with plant-based dyes like onion skins or nettles, creating softer, less vibrant hues. The poor had little access to the dyes that would make their clothing stand out, so their fashion became a reflection of their status, practical, functional, and, well, a little drab. This division in colour created a distinct visual hierarchy. It was easy to tell who was rich and who was poor just by looking at their clothes. But it wasn't just about the colour of their clothing, it was also about the materials used. The rich didn't just wear colourful clothes, they wore expensive, luxurious fabrics that gleamed in the light. Velvet, silk and brocade were the fabrics of choice for the aristocracy, while the common folk had to make do with coarse wool or linen. The difference in materials and colours was so stark that it became almost impossible to confuse the two classes. And yet, despite the rigid social divisions that colour and fabric helped create, there were moments of rebellion. In the later stages of the Middle Ages, as the power of the church began to wane and the influence of the monarchy grew, commoners began to experiment with their fashion choices. With the growth of towns and cities and the rise of the merchant class, clothing became a way to express individuality and wealth in new ways. While the rich had always used clothing as a way to show off their power, the merchants and traders of Europe were starting to use clothing as a way to show off their newfound wealth and status. This, of course, led to a bit of tension. The nobles saw these rising merchants as an affront to their own status, and they did not take kindly to the idea of commoners wearing brightly coloured, luxurious fabrics. The result was an ongoing battle between the old aristocracy and the rising merchant class, and fashion played a key role in this struggle. As the Middle Ages wore on and European society began to shift, so too did the role of colour in fashion. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the rise of the bourgeoisie and the growth of trade allowed for a wider range of colours and fabrics to become available. No longer were vibrant hues the exclusive domain of the elite. Now, even the middle class could afford garments made from finer materials and dyed in rich colours. This democratization of fashion marked a turning point in medieval society. Fashion was no longer reserved for the nobles. It was something that everyone could partake in, regardless of their social standing. This shift in fashion also marked the beginning of the end of the rigid class-based divisions that had characterized medieval society. Historians still argue whether this shift in fashion signaled a democratization of wealth or merely a redistribution of fashion trends? Did the growing accessibility of colour and fabric signal a new age of equality, or was it simply the result of increased wealth and trade? Some argue that this shift in fashion was a sign of the growing middle class, who were eager to display their newfound wealth in the same way that the aristocracy had done for centuries. Others contend that it was simply the natural progression of fashion trends, as the power dynamics of medieval Europe began to change. One thing is certain, though. Colour in medieval fashion was far more than just a visual element. It was a signifier of power, status, and wealth. Whether you were wearing the most vibrant purple gown or the simplest brown tunic, your clothing told the world where you stood in the social hierarchy. And as we move forward in our exploration of medieval fashion, we'll see that colour, along with fabric and embellishment, continue to play a significant role in shaping the way medieval people dressed. From the rise of the merchant class to the continued obsession with luxury and status, colour was just one more way to communicate your place in the complex and often contradictory world of medieval fashion. Let's talk about something that, quite frankly, may make you do a double take when you think about it. The fashion phenomenon of pointed shoes. Yes, you heard that right. Pointed shoes, also known as poulaines, were all the rage during the Middle Ages. Now, we're not talking about just any regular shoe here. These weren't your casual sneakers or leather boots. These were shoes with toe lengths so exaggerated they could practically touch the ground before your feet did. Imagine a pointed toe that stretched out several feet ahead of you, an accessory so extreme that it could only be described as, well, utterly bizarre by modern standards. But in medieval Europe, these shoes were more than just a fashion statement. They were a symbol of wealth, status, and even power. The pointed shoe trend began in the 12th century and reached its peak in the 14th and 15th centuries. It was a trend that transcended class boundaries. Both nobles and commoners sported them, though with varying degrees of extravagance. The most dramatic example of this style was the poulain, a type of shoe with a ridiculously long pointed toe that sometimes extended up to a foot or more in length. These shoes were made of leather, and in their most extreme forms the pointed toe was stiffened with wire or wood so it didn't bend. Can you imagine walking around with that kind of weight on your feet? I mean, how did they even walk without tripping over themselves? Well, that's where the creativity of medieval fashion came into play. The very length of the toe was a sign of social standing. The longer the point, the wealthier you were, or at least the more you wanted people to think you were. Wealthy noblemen and ladies would often wear these long-toed shoes as a way of signalling that they were of high status. The logic behind it was simple. The more extravagant the shoe, the greater the wealth and resources required to maintain such a look. Keep in mind that making shoes like these wasn't easy. Not only did they require high-quality leather, but they also demanded skill and craftsmanship. The materials and the time it took to make them were expensive, making pointed shoes a luxury item for those with the means to afford them. Interestingly, pointed shoes were not just about showing off wealth. They were also a kind of social signal that denoted your position in the social hierarchy. The longer the toe, the more fashionable and higher in rank you were. This meant that pointed shoes were a visible marker of your class, and as such, the rich were often very keen on wearing the most extreme versions. In fact, it became something of a competition among the upper classes. The length of your shoe's point was, at times, almost as important as your clothing or your title. There were even laws introduced to regulate how long your pointed shoes could be, as the nobility became concerned that the common folk were adopting this strange fashion and diluting its exclusivity. But as with most fashion trends, the popularity of these shoes was short-lived. By the late 15th century, the poulains began to fall out of fashion. People had become tired of tripping over their own feet and realised that practicality had to take precedence. Some historians argue that the decline of pointed shoes also signalled a change in social structure. As the Renaissance approached, the growing sense of individualism and the rise of more practical, elegant clothing led to a shift away from these eccentric footwear styles. Now let's take a moment to reflect on how utterly impractical these shoes must have been. Imagine a noblewoman or nobleman strutting around a banquet hall with their exaggerated shoe points dragging behind them. How did they navigate stairs? What happened if they stepped into a puddle or had to walk across a muddy street? The reality of wearing pointed shoes, no matter how extravagant, must have been a bit of a logistical nightmare. And yet, the desire to display wealth and power won over practicality, and for a brief moment in time, these shoes became the height of medieval fashion. Historians still debate whether the true purpose of the long-toed shoes was purely for status, or whether there were practical reasons behind them. Some believe that they were a form of protection for the feet, especially in battle, as the pointed toe might have been an early form of armour. Others contend that the pointy shoes were merely an aesthetic statement designed to attract attention. What's certain is that they played a significant role in medieval fashion, and their popularity left a lasting impression on the era's footwear history. Interestingly, the pointed shoe trend didn't disappear completely after the Middle Ages. While the extreme length of the polens eventually faded, the pointed toe continued to appear in various forms throughout history, from the fashionable shoes of the 18th century to the pointed stilettos that dominated women's fashion in the 20th century. The legacy of the medieval pointed shoe is still visible in modern fashion, albeit in a more refined and practical form. Today, the pointed toe shoe is a symbol of elegance, sophistication, and, yes, sometimes even power. But let's be real, no one is going around wearing shoes with toes that could double as a weapon. So, as we wrap up our exploration of these bizarre and fantastical shoes, let's remember that the medieval period was full of fashion trends that pushed the boundaries of what we would consider acceptable or sensible today. Pointed shoes were just one example of how fashion in the Middle Ages often defied logic and practicality. But for the people who wore them, these shoes were a marker of status, a symbol of wealth, and a way to stand out from the crowd. And in the world of medieval fashion, standing out was everything. As we continue our journey through medieval fashion, we'll see that the weirdness doesn't end with shoes. In fact, we're just getting started. From armour that doubled as a fashion statement to bizarre headgear that made people look like they belonged in a circus, medieval fashion was full of surprises. The era was anything but dull, and fashion played an integral role in reflecting the social, cultural and political changes of the time. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a deep breath, adjust our imaginary pointed shoes, and continue on with the journey through medieval fashion. Hold tight, because things are about to get even more strange. As we continue to delve into the curious world of medieval fashion, let's take a detour into something that might seem more practical, but in the medieval era was just as much about flaunting wealth and status as it was about protection. Armour. Yes, armour wasn't just for knights. It was also a form of high fashion, particularly for the upper echelons of society. While we often think of medieval armour as purely functional, designed to protect its wearer in battle, it also served as a canvas for displaying wealth, power and prestige. In fact, the line between functionality and fashion in medieval armour was often blurred, and we see this in the extravagant designs, ornate details, and decorative flourishes that adorned armour during the Middle Ages. First, let's take a look at how armour functioned in medieval society. Armour was a crucial part of the military apparatus in Europe. Knights and soldiers needed to be well armoured in order to withstand the brutal battles that were a regular part of medieval life. The armour provided protection against swords, arrows, and other weapons, ensuring that those who wore it could survive the harsh conditions of war. But while armour was designed for protection, it was also designed to send a message. The way a knight's armour was crafted, the materials used, and the level of detail in its design all communicated something about the wearer. Was the knight wealthy or poor? Was he a powerful lord or just a common soldier? Armour, in essence, became a reflection of one's social standing, just like the clothing of the nobility. The most obvious place we see this desire for fashionable armour is in the designs of the knights themselves. Take, for instance, the beautifully crafted suits of plate armour that emerged during the 14th and 15th centuries. These suits were not just about defence, they were about making a statement. The plates of the armour, made from steel or iron, were polished to a shine, sometimes even etched with intricate designs. Some knights went so far as to have their family crests or coats of arms emblazoned on their armour. These symbols not only demonstrated the knight's identity, but also helped to instill fear in their enemies. A knight clad in shimmering, beautifully decorated armour was not just a fighter, he was a symbol of his family's honour and wealth. Historians still debate whether the decoration of armour was a form of pure vanity, or whether it served a more practical purpose in battle. Some argue that ornate armour was meant to show off the knight's wealth and status, while others contend that the decoration served as a form of psychological warfare. After all, when you're facing a knight whose armour is shining like the sun and emblazoned with intricate designs, it's not just about the metal that's protecting him, it's about the intimidating aura he exudes. In many ways, medieval armour became a visual weapon as much as a physical one. But it wasn't just the knights who embraced the fashion of armour. Nobles and aristocrats also began to adopt certain elements of armour into their daily wardrobes. While they didn't wear full suits of armour all the time, they often wore pieces of armour for ceremonial purposes or even as a fashion statement. For example, nobles might wear ornate breastplates or chainmail shirts to banquets or tournaments. These pieces of armour were often highly decorated and polished to a shine, signalling the wearer's status. This combination of function and fashion is what made medieval armour so unique. It wasn't enough for the wealthy to simply have the best armour. They needed to have the most eye-catching, finely crafted armour as well. One of the most notable examples of armour as fashion can be seen in the tournaments and jousting events that became popular in the later Middle Ages. Jousting tournaments were not just athletic competitions. They were grand displays of wealth, power, and nobility. The knights participating in these events wore elaborate armour, often crafted to represent their family crest or symbol. In some cases, the armour was designed to be as flamboyant as it was functional. Some jousting knights wore gilded armour, with precious metals inlaid into the design, making their suits of armour look more like works of art than instruments of battle. These tournaments became social events, drawing large crowds who marvelled at the ornate armour and the spectacle of the joust itself. Knights in gleaming armour became the stars of the medieval world, much like modern-day athletes or celebrities. As you can imagine, the cost of such extravagant armour was enormous. Only the wealthiest families could afford to commission the finest armour, and even then the cost was often astronomical. The materials used, precious metals, gemstones, and the finest steel, were not easily accessible to the average person. As a result, armour became an even more exclusive symbol of wealth and status. A knight who could afford to wear a highly decorated suit of armour was essentially saying, "Look at me, I am powerful, I am wealthy, I am a force to be reckoned with." For the common folk, the idea of such armour was a far-off dream, something they could only see in the castles and estates of the nobility. Now, let's talk about the practical side of armour. While armour could be beautiful and ornate, it was also incredibly heavy and cumbersome. A full suit of plate armour could weigh anywhere from 40 to 60 pounds, and in some cases, it could be even heavier. This meant that knights had to be in excellent physical shape to wear their armour effectively. It wasn't just about looking good. It was about being able to move and fight in this heavy, restrictive gear. Despite the weight, however, knights became known for their ability to move quickly and efficiently in battle, thanks to the careful design of the armour. Over time, armour evolved to allow for greater mobility, with jointed plates and more flexible designs. Yet, despite these advances, wearing full armour still required a certain level of physical fitness and skill. Historians often debate the practicality of these armour designs. Were they truly as effective as the knights believed, or did they simply serve as a psychological weapon? Some argue that the weight of the armour made it difficult for knights to move quickly in battle, while others contend that the protection it offered was invaluable. The reality is that armour was a necessary evil for knights, providing protection in battle but also requiring a great deal of physical endurance to wear. In any case, armour played a crucial role in medieval society. It was a symbol of power, wealth, and status. For the knights and nobles who wore it, armour was just as much a tool for showing off as it was a means of protection. The intricate designs, precious materials, and elaborate decorations made armour a work of art in itself. But beneath the gleaming surface, armour was also a reminder of the brutal realities of medieval life: war, violence, and the constant struggle for power. It was a fashion statement that could save your life on the battlefield, but it was also a statement of identity, honour, and status in a society that was defined by its rigid class structure. As we move forward in our exploration of medieval fashion, we'll see how armour, along with other elements of medieval attire, continued to evolve. The fashion of armour was just one example of how the Middle Ages blurred the line between practicality and extravagance. Whether it was used for battle, ceremonial purposes, or as a symbol of wealth, armour played a defining role in medieval society, and its influence is still felt in modern fashion today. Now that we've explored the blinged-out world of medieval armour, let's turn our attention to something that, at first glance, might seem like a less exciting topic. But trust me, it's far from boring. We're diving into the history of the corset, a fashion trend that would come to dominate women's fashion for centuries. But here's the kicker. The corset didn't start off as the uncomfortable, restrictive garment that many people think of today. In the early days of its inception, it was more of a subtle, functional piece of clothing designed to shape the body into a certain silhouette. And, as with many medieval trends, it was as much about societal expectations and cultural norms as it was about personal style. The corset, in its earliest forms, appeared during the medieval period, around the 12th and 13th centuries, though it wasn't quite the tight lacing nightmare we imagine today. Instead, it started out as a long-fitted garment worn under the clothing, meant to support the body and create a smooth, elegant silhouette. This early version of the corset, often referred to as a stays or a kirtle, was primarily made of cloth or leather, and it was typically worn by both noble women and women of the working class. For the wealthy, it might be made from fine linen, silk, or velvet, but for the average person, it was simply a practical garment, worn for support and to hold the clothing in place. Historians still debate the true origins of the corset. Some argue that it was inspired by the ancient Greeks and Romans, who wore garments that were designed to shape the body. Others suggest that the corset evolved from earlier medieval garments like the haubergeon, a type of short fitted jacket worn by both men and women, which helped to define the body's shape. No matter the exact origin, one thing is clear. The corset was never meant to be a symbol of extreme beauty or fashion in the beginning. It was meant to be functional, helping to create a more refined silhouette and supporting the body. But as we know, the history of fashion is rarely ever so simple, and the corset soon began to take on a more extravagant and restrictive role. By the 16th century, corsets became more tightly laced, and were often reinforced with whalebone or steel. This is when the famous hourglass figure, the cinched waist and full bust, became a hallmark of female beauty, and the corset was seen as the tool to achieve this ideal. Women of the nobility would wear heavily structured corsets that were tightly laced to create an exaggerated waist, while still maintaining the illusion of a fuller bust and hips. The goal was to achieve the perfect shape, one that was considered a symbol of femininity, elegance, and class. But the rise of the tightly laced corset had its downsides. While the corset was effective in creating the desired silhouette, it often caused discomfort and in some cases physical harm. The tightly laced corset restricted the wearer's breathing, made it difficult to move, and often led to a variety of health issues, including weakened abdominal muscles, organ displacement, and fainting spells. It was a fashion statement that came at a steep physical cost. Still, despite the discomfort, the corset remained an essential part of women's fashion for centuries, becoming not just a physical garment, but also a symbol of femininity, grace, and the prevailing beauty standards of the time. There's an irony to the corset's rise to fame in medieval fashion. As it became more popular and more tightly laced, it simultaneously became a symbol of female repression. While women's bodies were being sculpted into the ideal hourglass shape, they were also being physically constrained. The corset, once a functional undergarment, evolved into a symbol of how women were confined by social expectations. The more tightly a woman laced her corset, the more she was conforming to society's narrow views of beauty and femininity. This tension between function and restriction, beauty and pain, is one of the most fascinating aspects of the corset's history. Historians still argue whether the corset's influence was entirely negative. Some scholars contend that it was a form of self-expression for women, a way to conform to the beauty ideals of the time while also claiming control over their own bodies. Others argue that the corset reinforced patriarchal control by dictating how women's bodies should look and behave. What we do know is that the corset was a defining element of medieval and Renaissance fashion, and its influence can still be seen in modern-day fashion trends, from waist-cinching garments to the corset-style dresses that have made a comeback in recent years. Interestingly, while corsets were primarily worn by women, the concept of body-shaping garments wasn't entirely exclusive to them. In fact, men also wore corset-like garments during the medieval period. Male versions of the corset, known as doublets, were designed to create a sleek, muscular appearance. They were often worn under armour or over shirts, and they were laced tightly to create a defined chest and waistline. These garments were less restrictive than their female counterparts, but still followed the same general principles of shaping and defining the body. In fact, the male doublet can be seen as a precursor to the more modern suit jacket, which is also designed to shape the body into a certain silhouette. Now, while we're all too familiar with the corset as an uncomfortable, sometimes oppressive fashion trend, it's important to remember that not everyone wore a corset, especially in the earlier periods. The vast majority of medieval women, particularly those in lower social classes, didn't have access to the luxury of tightly laced corsets. Instead, their undergarments were simpler, more practical garments designed for comfort and utility. These women wore long shifts or chemises made of linen, which served as both an undergarment and a nightdress. These garments were much more breathable and comfortable, but they still provided a certain degree of shaping to the body, albeit without the extreme restriction of the corset. But for those who could afford it, the corset was more than just a fashion accessory. It was a symbol of wealth, beauty, and conformity. The corset allowed women to conform to the ideal body shape of the time, even if that meant sacrificing comfort and health. This paradox, beauty through suffering, is one of the most enduring elements of medieval fashion, and it is something that would persist in various forms throughout history. Historians continue to debate whether the corset was truly a tool of oppression or a symbol of feminine power and agency. Was it a garment that reinforced gender norms and restricted women, or was it simply an expression of the fashion ideals of the time? The debate continues, but one thing is for sure. The corset was a defining fashion trend in the medieval world, and its impact can still be felt today in the world of fashion. As we move forward in our exploration of medieval fashion, we'll see that the corset was just one example of how fashion in the Middle Ages was about far more than just looking good. It was about defining power, status, and identity in a world that often sought to control those very things. After our exploration of the corset, let's take a step back and look at something that may seem somewhat less fashionable, but no less important: fabrics and fur. These two elements of medieval fashion weren't just about looking rich, they were about survival. Yes, survival. During the colder months, warmth was not a luxury, it was a necessity, and the materials people wore could mean the difference between life and death. However, beyond the practical need for warmth, fabrics and fur also served as powerful symbols of status and social hierarchy. The materials you wore spoke volumes about who you were, where you came from, and how wealthy or powerful you were. Now let's start with fabrics. As we've seen in previous sections, the Middle Ages were a time of great disparity between the classes. The common folk wore rough, undyed wool and linen, both of which were durable and functional for everyday life. Wool was particularly important as it was easy to come by, especially in Northern Europe. It could be woven into fabrics that provided warmth and protection from the elements. Linen, on the other hand, was lighter and cooler, making it a good choice for summer garments. These simple fabrics, though not as glamorous as their more luxurious counterparts, were the backbone of medieval life. They were practical, sturdy, and for the lower classes all they had access to. But for the wealthy, the story was quite different. The higher you climbed up the social ladder, the more extravagant the fabrics you could afford. Wealthy individuals could afford to wear finely woven silks, brocades, and velvets, fabrics that were often imported from the East. Silk, in particular, became a symbol of wealth and luxury, as it was costly and not readily available in Europe. These fabrics were more than just clothing. They were statements of power and prestige. The elite adorned themselves in these luxurious materials to visually demonstrate their elevated status. A noblewoman or a king wearing a silk gown or robe was unmistakably signalling that they were not part of the common folk. In addition to silk, another fabric that became highly sought after in the Middle Ages was velvet. Velvet was known for its softness, richness, and lustre, and it was often used for garments worn by royalty or the wealthy upper class. Velvet's popularity grew during the 14th and 15th centuries, thanks to its ability to create dramatic, opulent looks that were perfect for showing off wealth and power. But again, it wasn't just the nobility that wore these fancy fabrics. As the middle class grew during the late medieval period, the demand for finer fabrics also increased. Merchants, bankers, and skilled craftsmen began to wear silk and velvet, albeit in more modest forms, signalling the growing economic power of this class. Historians still argue over how the rise in demand for luxury fabrics impacted the social fabric of medieval society. Was the increasing use of luxury fabrics by the middle class a sign of social mobility, or was it simply an imitation of the nobility? Some historians argue that the middle class's growing affinity for expensive fabrics was a sign of their desire to gain the same social status as the aristocracy. Others contend that the use of luxurious materials by the middle class simply reflected their increasing wealth and consumer power. Whatever the case, fabrics played a pivotal role in medieval fashion, providing a clear distinction between social classes and signalling the wearer's place in the hierarchy. But there's another element of medieval fashion that we need to touch on, and it's one that might seem a bit more wild: fur. Fur was used by the wealthy not just for warmth, but as a symbol of luxury and exclusivity. The most prized furs came from animals like mink, sable, and ermine. The use of fur was particularly important in colder regions, where it served as an essential layer of protection against the frigid temperatures. But it didn't just serve a practical purpose. Fur was a status symbol, and the nobility was quick to embrace it. Fur-lined cloaks, hoods, and capes became standard fashion items for the rich. Kings and queens were often seen in robes lined with ermine, which was considered the most luxurious and expensive fur of all. It was said that the rich would wear entire cloaks made of ermine fur, and sometimes the fur was used to decorate the edges of garments or even the hoods and sleeves. Wearing fur wasn't just about staying warm, it was about showing off. The richer and more powerful you were, the more fur you could afford to wear, and the more exotic the fur, the higher your social status. This led to a sort of fur competition, where individuals sought to outdo each other with the most extravagant furs they could obtain. But what about the common folk? Surely they didn't have access to such luxurious materials, right? Well, that's where it gets interesting. While the poor couldn't afford to wear furs made of mink or sable, they did wear fur. However, their fur was often limited to more common animals like rabbit or fox. In many cases, fur was used as a trim on garments, like on the cuffs of sleeves, the edges of hoods, or around collars. The use of fur for the lower classes wasn't about making a fashion statement, it was about warmth and practicality. For peasants, fur was essential during the harsh winters, and it served a vital functional role in protecting them from the elements. One particularly fascinating aspect of fur use in the Middle Ages was the symbolic importance of certain furs. For example, Ermine was not just a luxurious fur, it was also a symbol of purity and nobility. The white fur of the ermine, with its black-tipped tails, was believed to be so pure that it was reserved only for the wealthiest members of society. In fact, the use of ermine fur was so associated with royalty that it became a standard feature of royal robes and ceremonial dress. Kings, queens, and high-ranking nobles would wear robes lined with ermine to mark their social superiority. To wear ermine was to announce in no uncertain terms that you were of noble blood. However, this exclusive use of ermine and other furs by the upper classes didn't sit well with everyone. In fact, there were laws in place in some parts of medieval Europe that restricted the use of certain furs to the nobility. These sumptuary laws were designed to keep the lower classes from imitating the wealthy. Fur became a legal marker of class distinction, with the wealthy wearing the rarest, most luxurious furs, while the poor were relegated to more common animal pelts. As we reach the end of this section, let's take a moment to reflect on how the use of fabrics and fur was more than just a matter of fashion. It was a way of signalling social status, power, and wealth. The materials you wore in medieval Europe were a visual representation of where you stood in the social hierarchy. Whether you were wearing a simple wool tunic or a fur-lined velvet cloak, your clothes told the world who you were. And as we move on in our exploration of medieval fashion, we'll continue to see how clothing was used not just for protection or modesty, but as a tool of power and identity. Let's take a moment to step into a particularly strange chapter of medieval fashion, one that has intrigued historians and fashion enthusiasts alike for centuries: the rise and reign of the codpiece. Yes, you heard that correctly. The codpiece was a fashion statement that took the medieval world by storm, particularly during the 15th and 16th centuries, and it has left us with questions that still echo through the ages. What was the codpiece all about? Why, in a time of political intrigue, courtly love and war, did men feel the need to accentuate their, well, masculine assets in such an overt way? To understand the codpiece, we need to take a step back and look at the broader context of male fashion during the medieval period. In the early Middle Ages, men's clothing was relatively simple. Tunics and leggings were the go-to outfits, and they didn't leave much room for what we might consider extravagant fashion statements today. However, as the centuries progressed, fashion began to shift, and male clothing became more elaborate. By the time we hit the late 15th century, men's fashion had evolved to embrace the luxurious, sometimes strange and occasionally impractical garments that we associate with the Renaissance. This is when the codpiece made its debut. The codpiece was essentially a padded pouch or covering that was sewn into the crotch of a man's hose or pants. At first, the codpiece was functional. It provided additional coverage and protection for men's most private parts, especially given the tight-fitting nature of late medieval pants. But it didn't take long for the codpiece to take on a life of its own. As fashion in the Middle Ages became more focused on excess and visual impact, the codpiece grew in both size and decoration. What started as a simple, practical addition to men's clothing quickly transformed into a bold, attention-grabbing accessory. Some codpieces were padded to create a pronounced bulge, while others were elaborately decorated with embroidery, jewels, or fur. Why did this happen? Well, historians still debate the exact reasons behind the rise of the codpiece, but there are a few theories that make a lot of sense. One theory is that the codpiece symbolized virility and masculinity. In a time when reputation and personal image were everything, a man's body was as much a part of his identity as his social standing or wealth. The codpiece, by accentuating the male form, may have been a way for men to express their masculinity, signalling that they were strong, powerful, and virile. It was essentially a form of visual bravado, similar to how modern fashion sometimes highlights specific body parts to make a statement. Another theory is that the codpiece became a symbol of status and wealth. Just like the elaborate fashion trends we've seen before, the codpiece was another way for the wealthy to flaunt their position. The more elaborate the codpiece, the wealthier the wearer. Some codpieces were lined with gold or silver thread, while others were embellished with costly materials like silk, velvet, or fur. A knight or nobleman could wear a codpiece as a way of announcing his high rank and wealth. Essentially, it became another canvas for showing off, much like a royal cloak or an intricately designed sword. If you were wealthy and important, your codpiece wasn't just a functional item, it was a work of art. However, just like the pointed shoes we discussed earlier, the codpiece eventually became a symbol of excess, and as is often the case with fashion, it eventually went too far. By the late 16th century, the codpiece began to fall out of favour. What had once been a symbol of masculine power and prestige began to look downright ridiculous. The exaggerated bulges and lavish decorations started to appear laughable, and many fashion-conscious men began to reject the codpiece as a symbol of vanity. The codpiece's decline coincided with the shift in fashion that saw men's clothing becoming sleeker and more streamlined, and by the time we entered the 17th century the codpiece had all but disappeared. But before we move on, let's pause for a moment and consider the strange and sometimes absurd world of medieval fashion. The codpiece is just one example of how fashion was used not only to make a statement about beauty or aesthetics, but to project power, wealth, and social standing. In a world where appearances were everything, it wasn't enough to wear just any garment. You had to wear the right garment, one that signified who you were and what you stood for. Whether it was an elaborate codpiece or a lavish fur-lined cloak, medieval fashion was all about making an impression. Historians still argue whether the codpiece was, in fact, a form of social commentary, or just another example of medieval extravagance. Was it a sign of masculine pride, a symbol of wealth, or just a bizarre trend that got out of hand? Some argue that it was purely an aesthetic choice, a product of the evolving tastes of the time, while others see it as part of a broader cultural fascination with the human form and sexual identity. The truth is likely somewhere in between, as the codpiece served both practical and symbolic functions. It was a way of making a statement, of saying, look at me, look at my power and wealth. And in that sense, it was just one more example of the way that medieval fashion helped to shape social roles, reinforce status, and define individual identity. But let's not forget that, for all the eccentricities and excesses of medieval fashion, there was a method to the madness. Every elaborate garment, every strange accessory, and every overly decorated piece of clothing had a purpose. Fashion in the Middle Ages was about far more than just style. It was about power, identity, and social structure. Whether you were a knight, a merchant, or a peasant, the clothes you wore told the world who you were and what you stood for. And while the codpiece may seem like a strange fashion choice to us today, for the people of the Middle Ages, it was just another way to define themselves in a world that was all about visual presentation. As we continue on our journey through medieval fashion, we'll see more examples of how clothing was used as a tool for identity and status. The codpiece is just one chapter in this strange and fascinating story. And trust me, things are about to get even stranger. Let's take a step back from the eccentric world of the codpiece and look at a part of medieval fashion that was not just about making a statement, but about solidifying a person's identity within the intricate web of courtly life. Royal fashion. It's often said that clothes make the man, but in the case of the medieval nobility, clothes made the king, queen, or lord. When we think of medieval fashion, it's easy to picture the elaborate gowns of kings and queens or the glittering armour of knights. But royal fashion wasn't just about looking good. It was about projecting power, authority, and divine right, and the garments they wore were as symbolic as they were beautiful. Medieval royalty understood that their clothing was a public declaration of their position in society. As kings, queens, and noble families ruled over vast territories, their clothing had to signify more than just wealth. It was a visual cue for everyone around them to recognise their elevated status. The grandeur of their robes, crowns, and cloaks wasn't just for show. It was a carefully calculated method of asserting dominance and reinforcing their legitimacy as rulers. Royalty's fashion was meant to tell the world, I am not just a person, I am a monarch chosen by God. Take the famous robes of the European monarchs. In the 12th and 13th centuries, kings and queens would often wear incredibly ornate garments made from the finest materials available. Velvet, brocade, and silk were popular choices, and these fabrics were often dyed in bright, costly colours like purple, red, and blue. Purple, in particular, was considered the colour of royalty, as it was so expensive to produce. The dye for purple came from mollusks and required vast amounts of time and effort to create, making it a luxury reserved for those in power. Kings and queens would not only wear purple robes, but would also use gold embroidery, gems, and precious metals to further enhance their attire. Historians often debate whether royal fashion was strictly a matter of display, or whether it was also tied to spiritual and political symbolism. On one hand, these garments were meant to assert the ruler's power over the people and maintain a clear visual separation between the nobility and the lower classes. On the other hand, royal attire was often designed with religious connotations in mind. The idea of divine right, the belief that kings and queens were chosen by God to rule, was prevalent throughout much of medieval Europe, and this belief was reflected in the way monarchs dressed. Their robes were often embellished with religious symbols, and some kings even wore crowns that were said to be blessed by the church. The garments thus became not just a reflection of earthly power, but a sign of divine favour and sanction. Beyond the fabrics and materials, royal fashion also included elaborate accessories. Crowns, sceptres, and rings were all worn to symbolise the ruler's authority. These items weren't just decorative, they were heavily symbolic. The crown, for instance, was more than just a piece of jewellery. It was a physical manifestation of the king or queen's right to rule. Without it, they were no longer royalty. The same could be said for the sceptre, which represented the monarch's control over the people and their lands. These accessories played a key role in royal ceremonies, including coronations and other events that marked the ascension of a new ruler. Of course, royal fashion wasn't just for kings and queens. Nobles, knights, and lords also adopted similarly lavish attire to signify their high rank. While their garments may not have been as extravagant as those of the monarchs, they still used clothing as a means of signalling their power. Nobles would wear richly embroidered tunics, cloaks lined with fur and jewelled accessories. Just like the royals, they used colour and texture to demonstrate their status. Fur, for example, was a prized material among the nobility. It was worn as a trim on robes, capes, and collars, to add an extra touch of luxury. The fur from animals like ermine, sable, and lynx was especially coveted, and wearing it symbolised both wealth and access to the best resources. But the desire to display wealth through clothing wasn't limited to the royal family or nobility. As Europe entered the late Middle Ages, the growing merchant class began to adopt more lavish attire as well. Merchants and tradesmen who had earned considerable wealth began to wear expensive fabrics and adopt the same style of dress as the nobility. This led to a rise in the production and trade of luxury textiles, which were now being used by an increasingly affluent middle class. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, even commoners began to adopt some of the finer clothing trends of the nobility, though they often had to settle for cheaper versions of the fabrics. As more people gained access to the symbols of wealth and power, it became harder to distinguish between the upper classes and the growing merchant class. This shift in clothing choices was one of the early signs of the social changes that would eventually give rise to the Renaissance, and later to the more democratic and class-conscious societies that followed. What's fascinating about medieval royal fashion is that it wasn't just a matter of keeping up appearances. It was a way of making sure the lines of power were clearly defined. Clothing was a powerful tool for communicating authority, wealth, and divine favour. The message was clear. If you wore the right clothes, you were part of the ruling class, whether you were a king or a noble lord. In a world that was dominated by hierarchical social structures, fashion served as both a marker of one's place and a tool for asserting dominance. This wasn't just a matter of aesthetic beauty, it was a matter of maintaining control. Kings and queens used their clothing to remind their subjects who was in charge. Nobles did the same with their robes, crowns, and fur-lined capes. And even the common people, though they were often relegated to more humble fabrics, used clothing to signify their status in society. This was the fabric of medieval life, and it was literally woven into the clothes they wore. As we move forward in our exploration of medieval fashion, we'll continue to see how clothing was not just about looking good, it was about creating and maintaining an image. Whether it was the extravagant robes of royalty or the carefully chosen colours of the middle class, fashion was always about making a statement. And in medieval Europe, those statements were powerful. Now that we've explored the regal world of royal fashion, it's time to examine the influence of one of the most significant cultural exchanges during the medieval period, the spread of Moorish fashion into Europe. This cultural shift, brought about by the centuries-long interactions between Islamic and Christian cultures through trade, conquest and the Crusades, had a profound effect on European fashion. At the heart of this exchange was the introduction of new materials, textiles and designs, all of which would leave a lasting imprint on the sartorial world of medieval Europe. So, let's take a deep dive into how the Moors, with their sophisticated textiles and opulent designs, reshaped the European fashion landscape. To start, let's set the stage for this fascinating cultural exchange. From the 8th century onwards, the Moors, Muslim peoples from North Africa, primarily from the regions that are now Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia, invaded the Iberian Peninsula, establishing the Islamic rule in what we now know as Spain and Portugal. During this period, the Moors brought with them a rich culture of intellectual achievement, artistic expression, and yes, exquisite fashion. The Islamic world had long been at the forefront of textile production, with skilled artisans creating fine silks, cottons and other luxurious fabrics that were virtually unknown in Europe at the time. In addition to fabrics, the Moors brought with them intricate patterns, designs and embellishments that would influence European clothing for centuries to come. One of the most obvious ways in which Moorish fashion impacted Europe was through the introduction of luxurious fabrics. The Moors had perfected the art of silk weaving, producing fabrics that were soft, durable, and often beautifully decorated with intricate designs. These silks were highly coveted in medieval Europe, where silk was not readily available. The silk trade became a key part of the growing European economy, with Italy and Spain emerging as major players in the textile market. As silk became more accessible, it began to appear in the clothing of European aristocrats, signifying both wealth and social standing. The introduction of silk was just one aspect of the Moorish influence. The designs and patterns used by Moorish artisans were also revolutionary. The Moors had a distinct approach to decoration, favouring geometric patterns, floral motifs, and intricate calligraphy. These designs were often seen in the textiles they produced, from clothing to tapestries and even rugs. The Islamic prohibition on depicting human figures, based on religious teachings, led to the development of non-figurative patterns that were highly stylized and abstract. These patterns began to appear in European garments, often woven into the fabric itself or embroidered onto the clothing. The influence of these geometric and floral motifs can still be seen today in modern-day textiles, but in the Middle Ages they marked a significant departure from the more simplistic designs that had been used previously in Europe. Historians still debate the extent to which the Islamic world's aesthetic principles influenced European fashion. Some scholars argue that the geometric and floral patterns introduced by the Moors were transformative, laying the groundwork for the ornate designs that would dominate European fashion during the Renaissance. Others contend that the Islamic influence was more of a gradual evolution, with these new patterns gradually being absorbed into the European aesthetic over time. Regardless of the specific timeline, it's clear that the impact of Moorish fashion was profound, as it pushed Europe towards greater sophistication and complexity in its approach to textile design. Beyond the fabrics and patterns, the Moors also brought new techniques in dyeing and embellishing textiles. The process of dyeing cloth had been an ancient practice, but the Moors refined it to a level of sophistication that Europe had never seen. They had access to a variety of dyes derived from natural sources, including plants, insects, and minerals. One of the most important dyes the Moors introduced to Europe was indigo, which became a vital part of the European textile industry. Indigo was prized for its rich blue colour which was both vibrant and durable. As it made its way through trade routes, it revolutionized the way fabrics were dyed in Europe, allowing for a wider range of colours in medieval clothing. The European nobility, always eager to flaunt their wealth, quickly embraced these new, vibrant dyes. In addition to the materials and dyes, the Moors also introduced new garment styles that would have a lasting impact on European fashion. One of the most notable examples is the adoption of the al-mulk tunic, a loose-fitting garment that became a staple of European nobility during the medieval period. This tunic, with its flowing sleeves and rich fabric, was both comfortable and stylish. It became a symbol of wealth and sophistication, worn by the elite during important events such as feasts, tournaments, and royal courts. Over time, the basic structure of the al-mulk tunic was adapted and incorporated into the European fashion repertoire, influencing the way garments were tailored and worn. But the most lasting influence of the Moors on medieval European fashion may have been the introduction of luxurious accessories, particularly jewellery. The Moors were known for their intricate craftsmanship in metalwork and jewellery making. They used precious metals such as gold and silver, as well as gemstones like pearls, emeralds and sapphires, to create elaborate necklaces, rings, bracelets and brooches. These jewellery pieces became highly prized among the European nobility, who sought to emulate the opulence of the Islamic world. Over time, these adornments became integral to royal and noble wardrobes, with men and women alike donning intricate jewellery to symbolise their power and wealth. The spread of Moorish fashion also had a significant impact on the development of Spanish and Italian textile industries. As the demand for luxurious fabrics like silk grew, these regions became centres of textile production. Cities like Florence, Venice and Milan became famous for their fine fabrics, and many of these textiles were inspired by Moorish designs and techniques. The process of importing these fabrics from the East, as well as the skills to create similar textiles, spurred the development of new technologies in weaving and dyeing. It's no exaggeration to say that the Moorish influence helped lay the foundation for the Italian Renaissance, which would later lead to an explosion of artistic and fashion creativity. Historians still debate whether the growing use of these luxurious fabrics and accessories was a sign of cultural exchange or cultural appropriation. Some argue that the Islamic influence on European fashion was a natural byproduct of trade and interaction between cultures. Others contend that Europe's adoption of Moorish fashion was part of a larger trend of appropriation, where the aesthetic and cultural elements of the Muslim world were borrowed without giving proper credit. Regardless of how you view this cultural exchange, it's clear that the Moors' contribution to European fashion was immense, influencing everything from textile design to garment construction to the very concept of luxury and fashion. As we close this chapter on Moorish influence, we can see how this cultural exchange played a pivotal role in shaping European fashion. The integration of new materials, textiles and designs brought sophistication and innovation to medieval Europe, setting the stage for the fashion revolutions that would follow. The luxury fabrics and intricate patterns introduced by the Moors were a key part of medieval Europe's visual identity, and their impact can still be seen in the textiles and fashion of today. The Middle Ages, as we've seen, was not just a time of war and politics. It was a period of vibrant cultural exchange, where fashion became a way to communicate power, wealth, and identity. And the Moors, with their exquisite craftsmanship and innovative designs, played a crucial role in this transformation. As we continue unravelling the fascinating world of medieval fashion, we now find ourselves at a crossroads of craftsmanship and creativity. The rise of the guild system in medieval Europe brought a new dimension to fashion and textile production, transforming the way clothes were made, sold and worn. But it wasn't just about producing fine garments for the nobility. It was also about organising the trade, standardising practices, and ensuring that the wealthier classes had access to the best craftsmanship available. The role of guilds in the medieval fashion industry is an often overlooked aspect of history, yet it played a critical part in shaping the sartorial landscape of the time. To understand the importance of the guilds, we need to start by looking at the medieval economy. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe was beginning to recover from the chaos of the early Middle Ages. As trade routes expanded, towns and cities began to grow, and an urban merchant class began to emerge. With this economic growth came the need for skilled workers who could provide the goods and services required by this burgeoning class. The solution? The formation of guilds. Guilds were essentially associations of artisans and merchants who banded together to protect their interests, regulate trade, and ensure the quality of their products. Each guild was dedicated to a specific trade or craft, such as blacksmithing, weaving, tailoring, or shoemaking. Within the fashion industry, the tailoring and textile guilds became particularly influential. These guilds had the power to regulate the production and sale of clothing, ensuring that only properly trained artisans could create garments and that the materials used were of acceptable quality. At their core, the guilds were all about quality control. Before the rise of these associations, anyone with a bit of sewing knowledge could throw together a garment and sell it. But as the demand for fine clothing grew, particularly among the nobility, it became necessary to ensure that garments were not only functional, but also elegant and well made. The guilds ensured that only those who had completed a formal apprenticeship and met certain standards could work as tailors or seamstresses. This resulted in a more consistent, high-quality product for consumers and helped elevate the art of tailoring into a respected profession. Guilds also played a critical role in the standardization of fashion. By controlling the production process, they could set regulations regarding the types of fabrics used, the colors allowed for certain garments, and even the types of embellishments that could be included. These rules helped maintain the social order, as certain colors and fabrics were reserved for the upper classes, while others were strictly for commoners. For example, purple, considered the color of royalty, was regulated by the guilds to ensure that only the nobility could afford and wear it. Similarly, expensive silks and velvets were reserved for the wealthiest, with the guilds policing the use of such fabrics. One of the most important roles of the guilds was their involvement in the burgeoning fashion industry. As trade networks expanded and the merchant class grew in wealth, the desire for luxurious, high-quality clothing became more widespread. But it wasn't just about personal style. It was also about status. Fashion became a key component of social identity, and the guilds were there to ensure that the most fashionable, expensive garments were available to those who could afford them. At the same time, they helped regulate the production of simpler garments for those who couldn't. The guilds were more than just regulatory bodies. They were also social institutions. They helped artisans network, share knowledge, and collaborate on projects. They provided mutual support for workers who had fallen on hard times, and they often served as a form of insurance for workers who faced health issues or accidents. In this sense, guilds were not only about fashion, they were about creating a sense of community among skilled workers and ensuring that the broader social fabric of the time was upheld. But the influence of the guilds wasn't confined to just the artisans and tradespeople. Their impact reached far beyond the workshop and into the streets of medieval cities. In fact, the guilds helped shape the urban culture of the time. As the merchant class began to rise in power and wealth, they turned to the guilds to find the best clothes, jewellery and accessories. The guilds were the gatekeepers of fashion, ensuring that the new urban elites had access to the latest styles and trends. They helped to create an environment where wealth was openly displayed through clothing, and where fashion was a key component of social status. Historians still debate how much power the guilds truly had in shaping medieval fashion. Some argue that they were the driving force behind the development of fashion as a regulated, standardized industry, while others believe that fashion was more driven by individual tastes and personal preferences. While there's no definitive answer, what's clear is that the guilds played a critical role in ensuring that the fashion industry operated smoothly, efficiently, and within certain boundaries. They helped to set the stage for the rise of the fashion houses and designers that would emerge in later centuries. The guilds also laid the groundwork for the development of modern fashion industries. Many of the techniques and practices developed by medieval guilds, such as apprenticeship systems, quality control, and standardized production, remain in use today. The idea of regulating fashion through guilds might seem antiquated, but the principles of craftsmanship, quality, and exclusivity that guilds promoted are still integral to the high-end fashion industry. As we move forward in our exploration of medieval fashion, we'll see that the guilds were not only involved in the production of clothing, they also played a key role in the dissemination of fashion trends. They helped to ensure that the latest styles, colours and fabrics were available to the aristocracy and the emerging merchant class. And as Europe moved toward the Renaissance, the guilds would continue to influence fashion, laying the foundation for the more elaborate and extravagant styles of the period. But guilds weren't the only players in the medieval fashion scene. As we'll see in the next section, fashion was also shaped by the influence of foreign cultures, especially as European countries began to explore the wider world. The age of exploration, fueled by the desire for new trade routes and wealth, opened up a world of new fabrics, techniques and styles, all of which would come to impact European fashion in the centuries to come. As we venture deeper into the evolving world of medieval fashion, let's take a moment to look beyond Europe's borders. While the rise of guilds and regional textile innovations had a significant impact on the development of fashion, there was another powerful force at play: foreign influences. The Middle Ages were not just a period of political upheaval and religious conflict, they were also a time of expanding trade, cultural exchange, and yes, sartorial innovation. From the Silk Roads of Asia to the bustling markets of North Africa, the world was slowly becoming more interconnected, and these far-flung regions were influencing European fashion in ways that would change the industry forever. One of the most profound effects of this cultural exchange was the introduction of new fabrics, materials, and designs. During the medieval period, Europe was exposed to the finest textiles, some of which were previously unimaginable. The most notable influence came from the East, particularly through trade routes that connected Europe to China, India, and the Islamic world. Through these connections, luxurious materials such as silk, fine cotton, and embroidered fabrics found their way into European clothing. Perhaps the most iconic fabric of the medieval period, especially in the upper echelons of society, was silk. The long-standing relationship between Europe and the East through the Silk Road made silk one of the most desired materials in medieval fashion. Its lustrous sheen, softness and richness made it an immediate favourite of the wealthy, but its high cost meant that only the most affluent could afford it. However, by the 12th century, as trade with the Islamic world intensified, silk became increasingly available, and Europe's growing merchant class could now access it. Cities like Venice and Genoa became hubs for the silk trade, connecting Europe to Asia and ensuring that luxurious silk garments were not just the domain of royalty, but also the newly wealthy. Alongside silk came other fine textiles, including the vibrant cottons and woven fabrics from India and Persia. The Moors, who had a long-standing relationship with the East, were key players in introducing these materials to Europe. Cotton, especially from India, was prized for its softness, and its vibrant colours, derived from natural dyes like indigo and saffron, made it a popular fabric in Mediterranean regions. By the 13th century, cotton became more common in Europe, and it began to be incorporated into both everyday and formal garments. The materials weren't the only influence that came from the East. The designs and techniques used in Eastern textiles were equally transformative. Islamic art, with its rich geometric patterns, calligraphy and intricate designs, made its way into European fashion. As previously mentioned in our discussion on Moorish influence, these Islamic patterns were often non-figurative, focusing on intricate geometry or stylized natural motifs, due to religious prohibitions against depicting human or animal forms. These patterns found their way into European fabrics, particularly in the form of lavishly embroidered garments worn by the nobility. Historians often debate whether these cultural exchanges were driven purely by luxury and fashion, or whether they were part of a broader attempt to consolidate power and status. Was it just a desire for beauty that led the elite to embrace these exotic goods? Or was it an effort to signal superiority over those who were unable to access such fine materials? Some scholars argue that the spread of these luxurious fabrics and designs was a tool for the aristocracy to differentiate themselves from the common people, who continued to wear simpler, more functional garments. In this way, Eastern fashion wasn't just about looking good. It was about reinforcing the societal divisions that were central to medieval life. The introduction of foreign fabrics and designs was not limited to the Islamic world or Asia, however. The Vikings, who had their own trade routes stretching as far as the Byzantine Empire and beyond, also played a role in introducing new materials into European fashion. Viking expeditions to the east brought not only trade goods like furs, spices and weapons, but also textiles. The Vikings themselves were known for wearing cloaks, tunics and trousers made from wool, but their extensive trade networks exposed them to a wide variety of materials from across Europe and Asia, which influenced the way they dressed. In particular, Viking traders interacted with the Byzantine Empire, whose clothing styles were highly intricate and fashionable, incorporating vibrant colours and silk fabrics into their attire. As these textiles and design techniques from the East spread throughout Europe, they began to influence not just the elite but also the growing middle class. As we saw with the rise of the merchant class earlier in the Middle Ages, the expansion of trade created an economic group with the wealth to spend on fine goods. These merchants and tradespeople, many of whom had gained their fortunes through trade with the East, adopted the lavish fashions of the nobility, using their newfound wealth to purchase luxurious silks, velvets, and cottons. Fashion, in this sense, became a visual display of social mobility, a way for the rising middle class to emulate the aristocracy's opulence. Historians still debate how much these foreign influences shaped European identity and culture. Did these new fabrics, patterns, and techniques contribute to the emergence of a more cosmopolitan European identity, or did they simply reinforce existing hierarchies? Some argue that the influx of exotic goods from the East led to a more globalized Europe, one that was increasingly connected to the broader world. Others contend that the rise of foreign textiles and designs only served to highlight the stark divisions between the upper classes and everyone else, with fashion serving as a symbol of elitism and exclusivity. Regardless of how we view this influence, it's clear that the importation of materials, styles, and techniques from other parts of the world played a critical role in shaping medieval European fashion. It expanded the possibilities for what was considered fashionable and desirable, and it gave rise to a period of unprecedented luxury and creativity. The impact of these foreign influences can still be seen today, not just in fashion, but in art, architecture, and the globalized world we live in. As we continue to explore the world of medieval fashion, we'll see that the cultural exchanges between East and West didn't just influence what people wore, they also helped shape the way people thought about wealth, status, and identity. The incorporation of these foreign influences was more than just an aesthetic choice. It was a way to communicate power, class, and sophistication. And as the world continued to expand through exploration and trade, these influences would only become more pronounced, ultimately paving the way for the fashion revolutions that would come in the Renaissance and beyond. Now that we've explored the rich and varied influences that helped shape medieval fashion, let's take a closer look at one of the more fascinating, albeit somewhat eerie aspects of how clothing intersected with death in the Middle Ages. This period wasn't just about lavish gowns and majestic robes, it was also about mourning and the rituals surrounding death, and fashion played a surprisingly important role in these solemn rites. In a world where the boundaries between the living and the dead were far more fluid than they are today, clothing became a key way of communicating grief, loss, and the proper way to mourn. Medieval mourning fashion wasn't just about wearing black, it was far more intricate and complex than that. In fact, mourning attire was deeply ritualized, with specific colours, materials, and styles being worn depending on your relationship to the deceased, the social status of the person who had passed, and even your own social rank. Just as a noble's extravagant robes could make a statement about their power, mourning garments were a visual sign of respect, grief, and social duty. To not wear the appropriate mourning attire was seen as disrespectful, both to the deceased and to society itself. For the nobility, mourning attire was a clear visual signal that they were fulfilling their social and religious obligations to mourn. When a monarch, noble, or important figure passed away, their family and close allies were expected to wear sombre, dark clothing for a period of time. The fabrics used were typically heavier and more muted than the luxurious silks and velvets they would wear in life. Wool was a common choice, as it symbolised both warmth and humility. The garments were often in shades of black, deep purple or grey, with darker colours representing deeper mourning. Some families would even commission special mourning clothes made from dark, thick woolen fabrics, which were not only a sign of grief but also a symbol of the enduring respect owed to the deceased. However, mourning attire wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach. The period of mourning varied depending on the status of the deceased. For example, the death of a monarch or close royal family member could lead to a year or more of mourning, during which time the deceased's family and high-ranking associates would be required to wear mourning clothes for a prolonged period. In contrast, the death of a lower-ranking individual might only require a few weeks or months of mourning, and the clothing worn during this period was typically simpler. Lower-ranking individuals might wear plain, undyed woolen garments or modest black dresses for women. In some cases, accessories such as veils, hoods or gloves might be worn to indicate the mourner's grief, and these accessories were sometimes even worn with the most basic of clothing. But what really stands out about medieval mourning fashion is how it reflected a deeply spiritual aspect of society. In the medieval world, death wasn't just a personal loss, it was an event that had deep religious and social significance. The act of mourning was a way of showing respect for both the individual's soul and for the broader Christian understanding of life, death, and the afterlife. Clothing became an outward expression of the inward state of mourning. As such, the ritual of wearing proper mourning attire was not just about grief, it was also an act of piety. The mourning garments served as a public marker that the mourner was fulfilling their religious duty, praying for the deceased's soul, and adhering to the traditions of Christian burial rites. Historians still debate the role of fashion in the medieval mourning process. Was it about public duty or personal grief? Some argue that the elaborate, ritualized mourning customs were deeply personal, tied to the emotional experience of loss, while others contend that they were social obligations that had more to do with public image than true grief. The reality likely lies somewhere in between. For the nobility at least, the appearance of sorrow was as important as the actual sorrow itself. Mourning was a performance, one that had as much to do with maintaining social respect as it did with showing heartfelt grief. There were also very specific guidelines regarding the colours and types of fabrics worn during mourning. For example, the colour black became strongly associated with mourning by the late Middle Ages, and this custom would continue to influence funeral fashion for centuries to come. But black was not the only colour worn in mourning. Interestingly, as the Middle Ages progressed, especially during the later years of the 14th and early 15th centuries, mourning fashion began to reflect a certain level of restrained extravagance. Noble families who had the means to do so often used mourning as an opportunity to display not just their grief but their wealth and status. Mourning attire might include luxurious fabrics such as velvet and silk, although in darker, more muted tones than the bright colours associated with ceremonial events. Even in death, fashion played a role in social signalling. However, the wealthier classes were not alone in using mourning to express grief or respect. During the Middle Ages, mourning attire was also a key part of funeral rituals for the lower classes, though their clothing would have been far simpler. The poor and working classes wore simpler, unadorned garments in dark colours to signify their mourning, and some might wear a simple piece of cloth, like a black veil, around their heads as a sign of grief. For them, the focus wasn't so much on lavish fabrics, but on fulfilling their duties within the family or community, ensuring the deceased's soul was remembered. The most unique aspect of medieval mourning fashion was the cultural imperative that came with it. It wasn't just about personal choice, it was about performing your role in society and adhering to the social contract. A person's ability to mourn in the prescribed fashion was often linked to their standing within society. In this way, clothing acted as both a personal reflection and a social marker, ensuring that proper respect and grief were publicly acknowledged. Interestingly, the practice of formal mourning gradually evolved. By the 16th century, European mourning customs were beginning to shift, influenced by the Renaissance's focus on individualism and personal expression. The rigid standards for mourning attire loosened a bit, though it remained an important part of funerary practices. What is clear, however, is that in the Middle Ages, mourning clothing was not merely a way of remembering the dead. It was a powerful tool for defining one's social and religious identity. The garments you wore during a period of mourning said just as much about your place in society as the clothing you wore in life. As we conclude this exploration of death and mourning in medieval fashion, it's clear that, just like the lavish garments of royalty or the practical tunics of common folk, mourning attire was another way in which clothing defined identity. Medieval fashion wasn't just about being seen, it was about being understood. In the case of mourning, it was about fulfilling a role that was tied not only to your emotions, but also to your place in a religiously, socially, and politically structured world. As we approach the final section of our journey through medieval fashion, let's step back and consider how these centuries of evolving trends and extravagant designs have left an indelible mark on modern clothing. It's easy to think of medieval fashion as something purely of the past, an era of outrageous hats, stiffened armour, and outlandish accessories. But surprisingly, the strange and often impractical fashion choices of medieval Europe have had a lasting influence that can still be seen in today's garments and the modern fashion industry. Medieval fashion didn't just disappear after the fall of the feudal system, it was the starting point for much of the fashion evolution that would follow. One of the most enduring legacies of medieval fashion is the concept of class distinction through clothing. The rigid class system that dictated what people wore during the Middle Ages has influenced modern fashion in more ways than we might expect. In the medieval period, your clothing wasn't just about personal style. It was about who you were. From the silk robes of royalty to the humble woolen tunics of peasants, the clothes you wore announced your social standing, and there was no escaping the judgment based on your attire. While this system of fashion-based class distinction is no longer as explicit, the idea that clothing signals one's social position persists in contemporary society. Think of designer labels today. A high-end Gucci or Chanel jacket is still very much a statement of wealth and status, and just like medieval nobles who wore extravagant fabrics to signal their elevated position, today's wealthy classes use fashion to communicate their place in society. However, just as the rise of the merchant class in the late Middle Ages led to a more fluid approach to fashion, we're seeing similar trends in modern society. Over the centuries, fashion has become more democratized, with high-end trends gradually making their way into the wardrobes of the middle and working classes. The medieval merchant class, empowered by wealth from trade, embraced luxurious fabrics like silk, velvet, and fine wool. Similarly, today's fast fashion industry, fueled by globalization and mass production, allows us to replicate the opulent looks of the rich, albeit in more affordable materials, at a fraction of the cost. What was once the exclusive domain of the aristocracy is now available to a much larger portion of the population. While the strict divisions of the past are no longer as pronounced, the influence of medieval fashion's class distinctions is still embedded in how we view clothing today. But there's more than just social symbolism at play in medieval fashion's lasting legacy. Medieval craftsmanship, particularly in the creation of tapestries, textiles, and embroidery, has had a profound influence on today's fashion design. The intricate patterns and fine craftsmanship of medieval garments, especially in the work of skilled tailors and weavers, set the standard for later textile industries in Europe. The detailed embroidery and the use of expensive fabrics introduced during the medieval period have evolved into modern design techniques that are still used in luxury fashion today. The focus on artisanal skill, intricate decoration, and the use of rich textured fabrics can all trace their roots back to the medieval period. Today's haute couture collections often employ the same delicate handwork and luxurious fabrics that defined medieval nobility's garments, from finely embroidered gowns to heavily adorned accessories. Let's not forget another significant influence from medieval fashion: the silhouette. The medieval period was pivotal in shaping how garments were designed to fit the body. The hourglass figure, often achieved through corsetry in later periods, has its roots in medieval attempts at shaping and defining the body's form. Though the formality of corsetry in modern fashion isn't as extreme as it was in the Renaissance, we still see elements of body-shaping garments, especially in the form of bodycon dresses, waistlines, and sculpted suits. The medieval focus on creating a specific silhouette, often one that emphasized the upper body or emphasized femininity, has translated into modern fashion's continual quest for creating defined, flattering body shapes. In many ways, the modern use of corsets as fashionable undergarments, or even visible pieces in some contemporary fashion collections, is a direct nod to the medieval origins of body-shaping garments. While we often associate the medieval period with heavy restrictive clothing, some aspects of medieval fashion laid the groundwork for more comfortable, functional designs. The rise of simpler tunics and the adoption of flowing, looser clothing in the later medieval period helped to set the stage for fashion trends that emphasized comfort as well as style. Today's more casual clothing styles, such as oversized sweaters, loose dresses and comfortable trousers, could be seen as a reflection of the medieval shift toward garments that prioritized ease and practicality. Though these pieces often still carry with them an air of refinement or modern sophistication, the medieval blending of practical clothing for work, trade and leisure with the luxurious garments worn by the wealthy also paved the way for today's trend of mixing high fashion with casual wear. Interestingly, another area where medieval fashion influences modern styles is in accessories. Think about the extravagant headgear worn by medieval nobles, such as crowns, hoods and veils. While we don't see crowns worn on the daily in modern society, the use of hats, headbands, and embellished headpieces can be traced directly to these medieval trends. The ceremonial use of crowns, as well as more casual head coverings like veils and coifs, directly influence modern headgear styles, from wedding veils to elaborate hats worn by guests at events like the Kentucky Derby. Even the popularity of hats during the Renaissance and Victorian eras echoes the medieval fashion trend of using head coverings as symbols of status and fashion. Furthermore, the idea of using fashion to signal allegiance and belonging, which was particularly evident in the use of heraldic symbols on clothing and armour, continues to persist in modern fashion. Today, we see elements of this idea in everything from the insignia on military uniforms to the use of logo-centric fashion brands that signify membership in a certain social group. Whether it's the badge of a high-ranking officer or the unmistakable logo of a luxury brand, the idea of using fashion as a form of identity and allegiance is very much rooted in the medieval tradition of heraldry. Finally, let's consider the curious and quirky side of medieval fashion, because let's face it, the Middle Ages were a time full of strange and bizarre trends that seem almost comical to us today. From the exaggeratedly long pointed shoes to the use of absurdly large codpieces, medieval fashion was often a spectacle, meant not only to showcase wealth, but also to entertain and amuse. While modern fashion might not have the same outlandish trends, we still see the influence of medieval whimsy in today's avant-garde and high-fashion collections. Designers continue to push the boundaries of what's considered normal in fashion, using humour, exaggeration, and surprise to make bold statements. The spirit of medieval eccentricity in some respects is alive and well in contemporary fashion, where innovation, experimentation, and the occasional oddity still reign supreme. In closing, as we reflect on the bizarre, beautiful, and occasionally baffling fashion of the Middle Ages, it's clear that this era was not simply a distant relic of the past, it was a foundation for the fashion world we know today. From class distinctions to the influence of foreign cultures, from luxurious fabrics to body-shaping garments, medieval fashion laid the groundwork for many of the trends, ideas and styles that continue to shape the fashion industry. Medieval fashion was a complex interplay of function, status, and artistic expression, and in many ways, it set the stage for the global, ever-evolving fashion world we live in today. It may have been a time of bizarre trends and extravagant excess, but it was also a time of innovation, creativity, and transformation, marking the beginning of the incredible fashion legacy that continues to captivate us today. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through medieval fashion. I hope you've enjoyed exploring the quirks, opulence, and artistry of this fascinating period. As we continue to weave the threads of history into modern fashion, one thing is certain. Fashion, no matter the time period, will always be a reflection of society, culture, and the times in which it exists. Sweet dreams,